Well, I think it's just because of the idea of this pause, that the worst case scenario is maybe not the worst case scenario. But, I go back to what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said this morning in his interview with Jonathan Farrow, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said, look, the 145% was because of China's retaliatory nature. If you go back to April 2nd and look at the Liberation Day of that 34%, it's a little bit more in line today with that 30%. So I think the market is going to wake up in the next day or so and realize that tariffs are going to remain elevated. Yes, it's not going to be as much as 145%, and that's a good thing. And maybe it opens up the boats so that they can start coming into the west coast of the United States, and we begin to, alleviate this idea of, shelves being empty and so forth like that. But elevated tariffs are still going to be here, and that's going to be the norm. We're really working towards this kitty scenario where it's like a 10% baseline tariff, maybe a little bit higher for other countries like China, with special exemptions, maybe for automobiles, pharmaceutical, tech, you name it.
Hey, Nathan, to what extent did politics play a role here? Folks on the Hill, maybe Republicans saying to this White House, hey, we got some elections coming up, and if we're talking about these super high tariffs, that could be a problem for us.
Yeah, I think there was probably more politics here than the White House is probably letting on. And I think it's not so much the elections, but more so of those 4th of July barbecues. Because, if you think about it, and if you believe the idea that, a lot of these ships coming into the West Coast of the United States are down 30 to 40%, these are the ships that are bringing over items for the Christmas retail season. And if you begin to see a combination of, President Trump's comments on, well, maybe American children don't need $2 or $30, they get $2. And with some, empty store shelves, and with the idea that maybe that we're going to get to a situation where small businesses are really harmed from this, I think this was sort of the White House's way of saying, look, we need to also try and save some face here. I didn't think they were going to go down to 30%. I think they around 60 to 80% is where you would have asked me on Friday, I would have said. But, going to 30%, it does give the market a lot of breathing room. Yes, we have lots of negotiations that have to take place over the next 90 days, but it's something the market can actually work with in terms of clarity purposes.
I also wonder if there's breathing room now in terms of dealing with a tax bill and focusing on deregulation. What's the timing of both of those things there?
Well, so for the tax bill, this tariff announcement actually hurts it a little bit from the standpoint that the House Republicans were hoping to use $2 trillion worth of tariff revenue to help pay for this bill, which is north of $5 trillion. And, if you come out and say, look, we're going to go back to a 10% baseline tariff for everybody, at least what the situation is turning out to be, you're not going to get anywhere close to that $2 trillion. So now the question is, how are you going to pay for it? Now, there's going to be some markups this week, House Energy and Commerce, House Ways and Means Committee. By this time tomorrow, you'll know exactly where the House efforts are in terms of gutting things like the IRA or changing the tax, provisions of this country. But what we're telling our clients is just remember, the House is throwing the kitchen sink in with this bill. They're throwing in things that we don't think will even pass the Senate parliamentarian and wouldn't even get under the what they call the bird rule, wouldn't even fly through that. So look for everything to be thrown in and then things to be scaled back. The biggest question, though, is how are you going to pay for it? And I don't think anybody on Capitol Hill on the Republican side knows how they're going to pay for it at this point. And as a result, there is a possibility that this may not be permanent. They may be pulling it back and saying, maybe it's only worth 4 to 6 years worth of tax extensions.
What are the dates that we need to pay attention to? Because, quite frankly, I am not paying attention. I am overwhelmed. But you tell me the date I need to pay attention here from what we're going to hear from Congress.
So for the next 2 weeks, you're going to see this debate in the House. Lots of headline risks. But again, it's just headline risks. Ultimately, we think a House vote will probably come at the end of this month or probably more likely in June. That's when the Senate's going to get it. The Senate's going to say, thank you very much. They're going to essentially throw it out, and then they're going to say, look, we will take and do whatever we want and send it back to you. We think that's going to happen around the 4th of July timeframe. This is also under the assumption that the debt ceiling remains in this bill. Because if the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the ex-date for that debt ceiling is in August, Congress needs to wrap this up before then. So we're thinking ultimate passage in that mid to late July timeframe. If the debt ceiling provision is stripped out, if they aren't anywhere close to, coming to a deal, they'll have to do the debt ceiling separately. And then the real deadline for this is probably going to be the October-November timeframe.
In terms of then the market, as we sort of look ahead to that, what's going to be the next catalyst within the next week or week and a half? What are you looking for?
So I think it's going to really be the House deficit Republicans. You know, this is Representative Chip Roy, for example. He just tweeted out about 20 minutes ago that he is not going to vote for a bill that he, in his words, would add $20 trillion to the deficit. Now, I'm not going to say that we think it will go that far, but, you know, you are going to see a lot of statements from Republicans who are not happy with this legislation, and it's just part of a negotiation. So look for this sort of seesaw moment of, yes, we have a deal, no, we don't have a deal. But I think for the next 2 weeks, you're going to see more negative headlines than positives. And then sometime maybe around Memorial Day, I think the Republicans will start to get a better idea of what that plan is going to look like in order to get House passage.